Welcome back to Final Trade. I wanted to talk about a game theory concept today called strictly better and strictly worse that comes up a lot in trading card games, but also generally in other types of games. Strictly better is when you have two cards where one is almost always going to be preferable to the other. Here's a card, Eager Cadet, 1 mana for a 1/1 creature, no abilities. And then here is the Honor Guard, also 1 mana for a 1/1 creature. They're both 7th edition even. They're even both soldiers. But the Honor Guard has the pump ability. So you would say that the Honor Guard is strictly better than the Eager Cadet, and the Eager Cadet is strictly worse than the Honor Guard. And there's no shortage of these kind of things if you know much about White Weenie. Here's a 1/1 with Banding for 1 mana, the classic Benelish hero. A 1/1 with First Strike, probably better than the Benelish hero even. And then, of course, the granddaddy of them all, the 2/1 for 1 mana with no abilities. So you end up in these situations where you'll have cards that are very similar, but some of them will always be better than others. So let's take another example. The classic Lightning Bolt versus Shock from Stronghold. Both 1 red mana, both instant speed, but Lightning Bolt does 3 damage and Shock does 2. They both are able to target the same targets. And this brings up a concept in debates on strictly better and strictly worse, which comes to what I would call reasonable deck building. And so people like to point out Shock, and there's these, in the entire 50,000 card history of Magic the Gathering, there are 2 or 3 or 4 cards that would make, in limited circumstances, Shock better than Lightning Bolt. But realistically, you're never going to say, well, what if my opponent has 1 or 2 or 3 of those 50,000 cards that will actually make Shock better? Should I put Shock in my deck instead of Lightning Bolt? No. No one's ever going to make that decision. So we would still say that Lightning Bolt is strictly better than Shock. So you get into some more creature examples. You have a 3/3 for 4 mana compared to a 3/3 for 4 mana who has flying. And so no other effective difference on these creatures. Mon's Goblin Raiders, 1 mana 1/1, or Goblin Balloon Brigade, 1 mana 1/1 with the option to make him fly until the end of the turn. And you can do this in multiple dimensions. So here's a 2/2 for 2 mana. And here's a 2/2 for 3 mana. So, you have to kind of balance the downside of the orc. But, in a lot of cases, the orc is going to be better than the ogre. Now, the troll is always better than the ogre because has the ability to regenerate if you need him to. He's same power and toughness, same mana cost. And then you have the Hurloon Minotaur. Now, he's 1 toughness greater than the ogre, and, he has a slightly different variation on his mana cost, but the same total mana cost. So you can have all these different dimensions that you have to evaluate strictly better and strictly worse in. Here's another funny example. Both of these creatures have the ability to pay a mana and have them be untargetable until the end of the turn, but the Homarid will tap when you do it, and he takes an extra turn to untap. It's just a weird extra cost, and there's no benefit to it. So you would say the Giant Crab is strictly better than the Homarid Warrior. A classic example, Strip Mine versus Wasteland. Strip Mine, of course, one of the more powerful cards ever made, and highly restricted in tournament play. And because it's so powerful, they eventually said, well, we've restricted it to death. Let's make Wasteland. It's a nerfed version, but maybe we can get by without restricting it so much. But obviously, Wasteland is always worse than Strip Mine. Here's kind of a funny example. Pendlehaven versus a Forest. So, almost always, you would say Pendlehaven is better because it has this extra ability that gives you an option. And, unlike a lot of special lands, it does not come into play tapped. Now, the interesting part is Both of these cards are vulnerable to strip mine, but only the Pendlehaven is vulnerable to Wasteland. And so you have to ask yourself, what kind of meta environment am I playing in? And am I likely to encounter Wasteland? Is that likely to hurt me an abnormal amount? So then you'll come across cards that are exactly equal. And it's kind of a special case of evaluating strictly better or strictly worse. Sometimes cards are exactly equal. The same casting cost, the same type. They're both orcs. They have the same exact effects, same power, same toughness. And, Ice Age did not have a set hoser card like Golgothian Silex and Apocalypse Chime were. They stopped making those by Ice Age. So these are exactly the same. Another good example of that, with a slight variation, my beloved Mana Elves, all 1 green mana for 1/1s who can tap to produce a green mana. They're all elves. Now, the Elvish Mystic, he came along later in Magic's history when they started assigning kind of classes as well as races to creatures. So he's a druid as well. It probably doesn't have a significant effect. And, most of the time when people discuss strictly better, strictly worse, they kind of ignore that because there aren't that many effects in the game that hose creatures based on their summon type. And most of them that do are generalized. It's name a creature type. It's not bury all druids. Those kind of things are much more rare. Another example where you have just the slight variation based on creature type. Again, like I'm saying, the designers, they just aren't that creative. They'll make the same card over and over again. But hey, if you're building a white weenie deck, you can really benefit from it because you can have 8 copies now of this creature in there. The famous Pump Knights, another example of it. Same exact creature. I know there is at least one effect in the game that specifically targets clerics. So again, you have to talk about reasonable deck building, and I have to come back to that because you're never going to say, I'll use the Knight of Stromgald on the outside chance that my opponent has the one effect in the game that targets clerics. You'd probably just use one or the other based on which ones you had available in your collection. Now, there is some situational nuance that can rarely matter. Here's an interesting example. So both of these are instant speed. They both deal 3 damage, but Incinerate prevents the target from being regenerated, and it costs 1 more mana. And so very, very rarely would you say that Lightning Bolt is not better than Incinerate. And, regeneration has kind of fallen out of favor with the Magic designers over the years. Back in Vintage Magic, there were many more creatures who had Incinerate than there are in Modern Magic. But it's one of these kind of edge cases where you can really look at this and think, well, is that extra non-regeneration ability worth the extra mana? And, just rarely it might be. A little more rarely than, say, having a elf instead of an elf druid. And another kind of example of that's a little more obvious. Well, they're both 2/2, first strike, white creatures for 2 white mana. And one has protection from black and one can block creatures with flying. And so we would almost always say that the longbow archer is better than the white knight. Now, if you're playing against a black deck, you probably want the white knight, but maybe you'd still prefer the longbow archer just because of the prevalence of Hypnotic Spectre. I don't know. So, think about those kind of differences when you're considering cards and ask yourself, is there a better card out there? Is there a card that's strictly better where I can get some kind of advantage with no drawback? And there are other variations to this, specifically colored mana required to cast the card. And I kind of touched on that here with the Herloon Minotaur and how, he did require 2 red and 1 colorless instead of 1 red and 2 colorless like these other ones I was comparing them to. And there are more examples of that where maybe you have to pay multiple mana colors to summon something or cast something. And then sometimes, like the Minotaur, it just requires more specifically colored mana with the same total cost. And there are examples, I searched and searched through my collection to see if I could find any of them, but there are examples where the speed of the card is different. So you will have the same effect, same casting cost, the same color card, but one of them will be instant and one will be a sorcery. And so that's another kind of example that you can come up with. So keep this kind of thing in mind. Think about it when you're building decks. There's a search engine online. I think it's called strictlybetter.eu that helps you try to search for this stuff. It's not very well put together, but it can help if you need it to. And then just use this as another tool in your game theory arsenal of how to think about games and how to be better at them. So if you like this kind of thing, join us here at Final Trade. Subscribe to the channel so you can get the newest videos. Hit like and leave a comment. Thanks a lot.